Thank you. All right, so let's talk about loneliness, which Mark Twain says the worst loneliness is to not be comfortable with yourself. And I think, as I've talked about before, everything sort of starts with us. And there's a distinction that I make between loneliness and solitude, and being alone and being solitary. And isolation can often accompany loneliness. So solitude brings us inspiration. It's a place for contemplation. It's a place for really kind of restoring ourselves and our souls in a way that's life-affirming, that's not creating depression or despair or shame. And so that's sort of the litmus test that I use, is by really tracking what does it feel like in my body to be alone right now, and am I feeling lonely because I have a sense that there's nobody out there to reflect back to me, or have I chosen this solitude today in order so I can reflect internally? People who are addicts often have an incredibly difficult time just being alone. People grow up sometimes with the TV as a babysitter, and so they always have to have the TV on or music on or some kind of distraction in the background, because being alone with the loneliness and despair internally is untenable. And, of course, part of healing and part of any recovery process is to be able to tolerate that feeling of loneliness, for starters, before you can start to move towards a recognition of self. So the question of what is loneliness is the absence of family, community, and friendship can lead to isolation and depression. Lack of companionship, while seemingly the opposite of emotional dependency, withers our soul. And human beings are sexually gregarious creatures. We are absolutely wired for attachment and connection. And when that doesn't happen, as I've talked about before, early on, then certain brain-body connections are not made in a robust way. And that will leave people feeling chronically depressed or alone and lonely for years to come. And then what we do is we try to get into relationships, and we hope that we're going to find that one person who's going to put their finger in the dam of that loneliness. And initially, in love, it actually works. We start feeling like this one person is going to be able to save us, make us feel whole and complete, that we can't live without them, because in effect they're replicating what we did or didn't get in early childhood, really in infancy. And so we're constantly seeking to repair in relationship what we didn't get as children. And this is not just psychological. This is embedded deep in our most primitive brain, in what we call the limbic system, for those of you that are conversant in that language, but in the part of the brain that's responsible for emotions. That part of the brain imprints implicitly from the time we're infants all the way through childhood what relationships look like. So if you had a mother or a father who were not able to attend to your needs for whatever reason, then there's going to be an implicit imprint in the brain down into the body of loneliness, we could say. And so no matter what we do or how we do it, we'll try and find a relationship that will heal that, and we'll think we're choosing somebody who can give us that, but because our brains are encoded in a particular way, we'll inevitably choose somebody who's not really going to be able to come through for us. And that is the process of healing and healing through relationship, and I'll get back to that. So when we have an absence of people around us, it can either impact these early relational traumas, or it can send us into an existential crisis of what is the meaning of my life if I don't have somebody with me. And for those of you who have ever traveled alone, which is really challenging, people seem to do it in their late teens and early 20s, much more adventuresome, less afraid of being alone in the world, because it's so much easier to meet people and kind of connect with them and keep on traveling with them, than later in life when we actually embark on something alone, where we can start to feel this profound existential loneliness. So do you know the difference between loneliness and being alone? And if you have any comments on that, please chat them to me so that I can pick them up and expand on those topics or answer your questions. Being alone and enjoying your company is actually a sign of mental health, which is where I started this conversation, that when you can really tolerate your aloneness, when you relish in your aloneness, whether it's going for a walk or going to have a cup of coffee and read a book, or even going to a movie alone, I actually find that going to a movie alone is a great escape, and I always feel like I'm playing hooky because nobody knows where I am, nobody can find me, and I can disappear into another world all by myself. And there's something for me that feels really delicious about that, whereas people who are alone all the time may find going to a movie alone really depressing and not helpful at all. So do you know the difference between the two, and do you enjoy your own company? And if not, why not? And when you are alone, do you always have something for distraction around you? Can you tolerate silence, or does it raise your anxiety? And making the distinction between being alone and being lonely are two important different distinctions. So what I want you to hear here is that there is a difference between the two, and that being alone and enjoying your own company and your own solitude is a good sign of health. Chronically being lonely and despairing when you're alone means that you have some difficulties you need to work through. When loneliness is a constant state of being, it harkens back to childhood, where neglect and abandonment were the landscape of life. When the child is looking for attunement from the mother, when the infant is looking wide-eyed, we all know that look of babies where they're constantly looking, and the mother's face is the most novel thing possible for the child to engage in. There's high level of novelty in that face that's looking back, that's mirroring the expression in the face of the infant, whether it's smiling or cooing, making gesture, touching the baby. All of that is an implicit conversation that's happening in microseconds that's encoding the infant's brain and body that says you're not alone, you're wonderful, you're magnificent and precious as you are, and that is building structures of self inside the infant. But when the infant is neglected constantly, those structures and functions don't get built. They literally do not get built into the system, and that can lead to a lifelong depression or feelings of abandonment or neglect or loneliness. Or let's say those systems were built and they were built good enough, but then there was a divorce or there was some sort of horrible crisis or trauma that occurred that sent the child into a spin of feeling like somehow it was their fault and that they're going to be alone and they're never going to have the attachment of a parent. So I've had, plenty of people tell me that there was a time in their life when they remembered the day their parents told them they were divorcing, or they remembered the day that their father left and he never looked back. He never came back. He never communicated with the child again. And so for decades, that person felt like there was something wrong with them and that they could never, ever figure out who they were because they didn't have a father reflecting back to them with any kind of regularity. So if your parents abandoned you because they were incapable in some way or they literally left, then it's highly likely that you're going to have some difficulties with loneliness and being alone. Without consistent caring contact with adults, a young person will be left with this emptiness and a sense of uncertainty about personal identity and fears of being alone. So I wonder if any of you have had that experience and if you struggle with this question of who am I if I'm not in relationship, and how do I deal with this sort of hollow emptiness that I feel all the time. And if you do and you have a question about that, please ask a question or chat me the question. So as I was saying, that it's about consistency, that children need consistency as much as they need anything else as young adults and children, maybe more than they need love. And that creates a personal identity when we internalize the parent, when we can go out into the world and feel like we're okay because we were told we were okay. And when children are toddlers, they start to walk away from the parent, and they go out and explore the world until they bump their head or they trip, and then they cry, and they need to know that they can come running back to mom or dad who's going to regulate that and make them feel good about themselves again, and not just good about themselves, but that they're okay and safe in the world. And then this same period takes place probably around teenage years also, when like the toddler, the teenager doesn't need the parent anymore, and they know better and they know everything and you don't know anything. But when they go out into the world and they trip or fall or, wreck their car, they come running back to mom and dad saying, help me. And mom and dad, if they are solid and secure, help the child learn the lesson and get through what they need to get through. So somebody asked a question here, and, I will give you a version of that, where people say that they're fine when they're alone, actually, that their insecurities get kicked up when they start dating somebody. And that, of course, is when we're going to have all of our issues come up. So what happens, sorry, I was just reading this question. That was a private question. As I've said before, none of us have any issues when we're alone. Our issues get kicked up when we're in relationship to somebody else. And so when we start to communicate with another and we're not getting our needs met and we're not communicating explicitly what those needs are, we're going to feel like we're alone or we're never going to get what we want and need. And that desire to have our partner know, to mind read, if you will, to know implicitly what our needs are, is an infantile desire, and it's one that's not likely ever going to get met because that window is closed. But it's a natural desire to say, gosh, I really wish he would just know what to do or know where to take me or know how to say goodnight in a way that's going to make me feel cared for and safe. But part of being an adult is being able to communicate what those things are. What you know that you need and like and make you feel good. And it might be as simple as saying to someone you're dating, when you get out of the car and you walk me to my front door, even if you can't come in because it's late, but you at least stand there with me while I unlock the door and give me a hug before we say goodbye, that makes me feel really safe and cared for, and it's important to me. That is an adult communication as opposed to saying goodbye in the car or maybe making out in the car and then you get out of the car and walk to your door, and he may be thinking, wow, that was great, we made out in the car, but you're thinking, oh, I feel so lonely because the simple act of being walked to the door wasn't followed through with, and that's what you need. And all your insecurities get kicked up, and then you're afraid to say what you need because you're afraid you look more insecure. But the truth is you actually look more adult and more authentic when you state what you need, and then your partner has the good pleasure of being able to give it to you. And if that person ridicules you or they can't give it to you, then you probably shouldn't go out with them again because that's information that it's not going to look good for the long haul. Someone also asked about the response to not having a perceived intimate partner as validating mirror of proof of life tool being capitulated into an existential crisis. And I think what I was saying is that you have to make the discernment between whether you're really getting your needs met in the relationship or not, or if the loneliness of being in relationship with somebody who's doing an adequate job of loving you is really pushing you into a bigger crisis of who am I in the world, and this is what I'm calling an existential crisis. For example, in my relationship, I feel deeply loved and cared for, and I have a family that cares about me. I know that. But there's something in my original wounding, in the loneliness of my childhood, that may never get repaired by my partner, by my now elderly parents, by my child, because structure. It's part of the structures in my autonomic nervous system. And while they're more healed now than ever, I may take that to my grave, but I can't pull at my partner to 24/7 attend to me because I'm not an infant. I have to find ways of self-soothing that, ways of talking about it, ways of just going to him and saying, hey, can I have a hug today because I'm not feeling so great maybe, and knowing that at least I'm getting that. It may never permanently fill any hole, but it may also have me asking questions about, what am I doing with my life? And is this the life I want to be in? And if it's not the life I want to be in, what can I do differently? And then I have to start restructuring my life. So these are complicated matters that dovetail into one another, and we have to be discerning about figuring out what's what. Someone says, how do you suggest avoiding a sense of loneliness in a child when a divorce is unavoidable? Well, that's a really difficult question because we cannot save anybody from their own feelings. And when people are going through a divorce, my best recommendation is that they be as absolutely attentive to that child as they possibly can and put all of their silliness and their anger, hurt, and resentment towards each other aside or deal with it in absolute private. But both parents have to sit down with the child and say to them, explain to them in the age-appropriate language why they're separating and that no matter what, you still love the child more than anything. And while the two of you can't live together anymore, you still care about each other, and you're going to do everything you can to make sure that their relationship with both of you stays intact. And then the two of you need to do that. You need to keep all fighting, all contention, all immaturity out of ear's reach of that child so that the child doesn't start to feel the anxiety and tension, which is what's going to start to destabilize and dysregulate that child. And if you're super angry at your partner that you're divorcing and you have to go pick up your child, then you need to find a way to regulate that down by talking to somebody or having maybe your mother or sister go pick up the child that day, a family member, until you can get it together to be more regulated. Because the child will read this dysregulation implicitly, meaning that you might say that you're okay and putting on a happy face, but your nervous system's not happy, so the child's nervous system is going to read that, especially depending on the age. So conscious conversation, explicit conversations, letting them know exactly how the custody is going to go, how you're going to separate, when they're going to see the parent. So I have a colleague, Jennifer McIntosh, in Australia, whose expertise is what she calls building a bridge between the parents for how they hand the child off. When you meet your ex and you're handing the child off, are you facing each other? Are you kind to each other? Are you soothing the child as you make the transition? Or are your backs to each other and you're just handing the child off and running? So it's your job to be a decent human being, both of you, in service of your child. Somebody else writes, I'm great at being alone when I'm in a relationship. I like my own time and my time with my partner. I tend to attach to avoidance, though. They spend time on their own outside of the relationship, and I end up begging for their attention. So this is not an uncommon thing. I mean, Stan Tatkin talks about the avoidant and the anxious, angry resistant partner. Harville Hendricks talks about the fuser and the avoidant. So if you're avoidant, you're going to end up with somebody who's a fuser or somebody who's angry and resistant, and that's probably replicating some of your childhood issues with one parent or the other. So we tend to get in relationship with the best in our parents and the worst in our parents so that we can work things out. So why do you attach to avoidant? What disowned part of yourself is that person showing you? And maybe if your tendency is to fuse in relationship, it's because you didn't get your attachment needs met as a child. You look at an avoidant person and say, wow, they look really independent, and I want some of that. And that's a natural desire. But then when you get in relationship with them, you see that they're actually hard to reach, and they don't come towards you the way you want to. So these are sort of deeper couples issues that the two of you have to work out that really have to do with, again, being able to hear each other, to say to him, when you spend more time outside of the relationship than on the relationship, more time outside than on me in the relationship, it leaves me feeling lost and alone. And then that person has to be able to hear that and empathize with you and see if they can make some changes to spend more time with you. Likewise, you have to look at whether you're putting all your eggs in one basket and trying to get all your needs met from your partner. I almost said parent. Because if you expect that person to meet all of your needs, then you are always going to be disappointed because of the way that you're setting it up. So if we go back to the PowerPoint here, it's natural for children to either use other people to feel better, which is what we've been talking about, or isolate into an inner world, which is the go-to survival option. This can eventually have one feeling even more lonely while in a relationship. So there are people that are more avoidant who will complain endlessly that there are no good people out there today, there are no relationships, I can't get what I want and need, and I'm just so lonely and alone, but they will not put in the effort to do what it takes to meet somebody. And it gets increasingly more difficult as we age to date, and now we're in a world of internet dating where it gives us multiple choices and expands our choices, but it can also open us up to vulnerabilities because we don't really know who we're meeting and who we're going to end up with. So I would advise you to be very, very careful about internet dating by getting scrupulous about what you're really looking for in a person, and then creating your profile accordingly, and when you do, screening people and paying attention to how they respond. If they are already sending you poetry before you've had a first date and expressing their undying love, I would suggest you run, no matter how lonely you are, because that's not a good sign. That's somebody who's not grounded and centered in who they are. And if they're making it all about them and they don't ask any questions about you, I would suggest you run also. So on this matter, there's a really terrific book by Charlotte Castle called If the Buddha Dated. It's not a very big book, and it helps you explicitly write out criteria about what you're looking for in a partner. What are you looking for? And then she has you also get clear about what you're bringing to the relationship, so that when you start to date, you can date with boundaries and you can start to say no. And sometimes just the act of dating can make you feel even more lonely because you have to kiss a lot of frogs before you find your prince or princess. But being able to say no, the more you say no, the more when yes appears, you'll know it. It'll be a resounding yes for you. So if you're lonely, if you want to be in a relationship, then you have to get out there and date. Another preferable tactic, and it's not always realistic, is for you to tell all your friends and family, the people that cut your hair, the people that whomever you're involved with, your chiropractor, anybody that you tell them that you are open to dating, that you're looking for a relationship, and if they know anybody, you're willing to go out with them. So the name of that book, again, is If the Buddha Dated. You can find it on Amazon. And the author's name is Charlotte Castle, Kasel. Without consistent caring contact with adults, and I've pretty much covered that, but a young person will be left with emptiness, uncertainty about personal identity, and a fear of being alone. And that's because they're not internalizing the other. When we build securely attached children, they internalize us and they leave with our voice inside of them. So I always know what my mother would say about a situation. And one of the gifts of that is when our elders pass away, when our parents pass away, if we've internalized them, even after they're dead, for as painful as that is, because we can never see, touch, feel, or talk to them again, we always have their voice in their head. We always know what they would say. They can still make us laugh because a phrase or something will arise. And in that moment, there's a connection. When children don't get that, they're left feeling uncertain about who they are and empty inside. And it's natural for such a child to either use other people to feel better or isolate. And both of these choices fail them as adults to reach out to other people for love, comfort, connection, or to validate their needs. So that is a perfect setup for addiction, where people will use drugs, alcohol, sex, spending, or any number of other isms, food, in order to regulate themselves and make the loneliness go away. So if you're feeling lonely, if you're chronically lonely, the challenge is to stop doing the things that make the loneliness go away and to really dive deeply into the loneliness and see what's there. And maybe in that place, you draw your loneliness, you dialogue with your loneliness. I highly suggest you work with a therapist if this is the case, and that you start to notice what part of you, what infantile part of you is longing for. And it's likely, to be held, to be seen, to be listened to be mirrored back, which is what we get in partnership, and we have to give it in partnership too. And these are profoundly intense callings as an adult. And unfortunately, what happens today is that we tend to isolate more because we have so many distractions that we can do that with television, the internet. Facebook can make us feel like we're having friendships with people who we never see, and while it's a fantastic way to keep in touch with people and stay up to date, it's not a real relationship. So let's talk about mutual loneliness and codependence now. And there's nothing worse, I think, than being lonely in a relationship. There's a song, I forget who sings it, but she says, I think my bed feels warmer at night when you're not here. And that's a really chilling statement. We always hear that getting love begins with loving ourselves, and that's a great start, but ultimately we need other people to love us. And that's one of the great paradoxes in life. There are many, many, and as I've said, there are many in recovery also, but you have to love yourself before you can really find someone who's going to love you appropriately, because if you don't, then if you're treating yourself poorly, you're going to get in a relationship with somebody who treats you poorly. And the worst example of that is domestic violence, or being in a relationship with an addict who you feel is gaslighting you all the time, and you feel lonely and crazy and you don't know what's going on. And maybe you picked that person because you weren't at your best self at the time you did. Maybe you were. It's hard to say. Oh, somebody just asked me what gaslighting means. That's a literary association to a movie that Alfred Hitchcock made called, I want to say it was called Gaslight. I just forgot the name of the movie. But the character in the movie was driving his wife crazy by turning down the lights, and she would ask him if the lights were getting dimmer, and he would say no. And she was starting to lose her mind. So that's what gaslighting means. When you're in a relationship with somebody and you have a gut instinct about it, and you know something's not right, and you ask them and they say no, you're making a mountain out of a molehill, or you're imagining that, or you must be crazy. And it starts to whittle away at the person's intuition. So being emotionally healthy and loving yourself means that you're going to surround yourself with people that treat you in kind. That said, all of us have some sort of attachment difficulty. There are people who are completely securely attached, but most of us have some sort of insecure attachment, and in so doing, we need a partner in order to help us heal those things. And everybody picks the wrong person. Everybody thinks they've chosen the wrong person. They fall madly in love. They ignore the person's deficits. They overlook the things that aren't okay with them. And then the things that aren't okay that they thought were kind of cute and quirky, they end up hating down the road. And that's an opportunity for change. In our culture now, 50% of the people bail out and get divorced. So you've got to understand that you are picking the right person no matter who they are, if you're picking from the best in you. And that person will help you heal faster than anybody. So you have to love yourself, but you also need somebody to love you in order to heal. Somebody says, please discuss extroverts and introverts relative to loneliness and solitude. Well, I think that's a good question. There are people that are extroverts that aren't lonely because they surround themselves with people and they're in motion 24/7, but sometimes those people aren't really in touch with a tender part of themselves and can be quite narcissistic. So they don't even know that they're not lonely. And that they, and that's my experience. And you have to remember that I'm sitting in a place working as a therapist where people come to me because they have problems, not because they're securely attached, but because they're struggling. But oftentimes the life of the party can be a very lonely person because they have hundreds of acquaintances but no real friends. And the introvert may really love their solitude. I'm actually very compatible with solitude. I love quiet. I love silent retreats. I love being able to just be still. It's very compatible with my nervous system. But I wouldn't want to tip into isolation because then I start to feel lonely. So while I would say, I don't know whether I'm introverted or extroverted, probably a combination of both, there are times when spending too much time with other people feels like a distraction from myself, and feeling too much time alone starts to feel isolating. So each person has to pay attention to who they are and what's true for you. And this is really the message in so many areas today. This is happening even in yoga classes today. 10, 15, 20 years ago, there was a right way to do yoga. And what yoga practitioners in this country have seen and learned over time, and the trend in yoga, is that you're working with your own body. It's not about hitting the poses in perfect synchrony or perfect structure. It's about what does your body want to do on this day. And let that be good enough, and that is your practice, not the yoga teacher's practice. Don't try to do what they're doing or you'll hurt yourself. Do what you do, and that is the truth of your own instrument, your own true nature. So pay attention to your own true nature. If our self is weak and needs other people to prop it up, it can become unable to function and keep us from attaining emotional self-reliance. So that would be the ultimate in what we call codependence. And the word codependence comes from the field of addiction. It does not come from the field of psychology. So keep that in mind. There are some people who don't believe in it as a concept at all. I believe that codependence is about relational trauma, that when we grow up in a family where there are difficulties and the child adapts itself in order to get its needs met, that's codependence. But it's not born out of a weakness of character. It's born out of a need to survive. So if I have a rageful parent, and I have to accommodate that parent by walking on eggshells and making sure that parent's okay, and I bring them dinner every night, or they take their dishes off the table because I want them to be happy, and I'm always looking to make mom or dad happy because when they're happy, I don't get yelled at or worse yet, beat. Then, of course, as a child, I'm going to do that all the time because it's my survival. And then I'm going to go get in a relationship with somebody where I think I have to do that all the time in order to survive. That is a maladaptive strategy that over time is only going to make me miserable. So if I or if you or anybody needs somebody to prop them up constantly in order to function, that's a form of emotional crippling. And that is a very, very dangerous place to be in life. Most of us do that to degrees. And again, these are very, very tricky matters because when you get down to that which is granular, how do we know when we're in a long-term love relationship whether or not we are in an interdependent relationship or a codependent relationship? Because we do things all day for each other, and we want our partners to do things for us as well. And sometimes it's codependent and sometimes it's interdependent. I always ask myself, if I do this, is it going to cost me something? If I go run this errand for my husband, is it going to make me terribly late for something else and then I'm stressed out and I'm resentful? If it is, I should say, no, I can't do this for you. If it's not going to cost me anything and it's going to lighten his load, then sure, I go do it. And, these things are by degrees, whether it's picking up dry cleaning or some big emotional situation that we have to really tease out what is going to topple us out of our integrity and out of our own regulation versus what it means to give and take care of our partner. So again, it's a paradox. Depending on others to ease our pain or erase our loneliness eventually weakens us and therefore proves dangerous. Now, that is if you have a dependence on the person. Depending on somebody in a healthy way, if something bad happens today, let's say you get a parking ticket and you feel like it was unjust and you're angry and you go to your partner and you want them to ease your pain around it, that actually strengthens you. It doesn't weaken you. But when this weakness keeps us in a toxic relationship where mutual using marks the drumbeats of a codependent dance, then you're in trouble. And this usually happens in highly addictive relationships or where there's domestic violence. So if both of you are, in active addiction, or one person's alcoholic, the other one is enabling the alcoholism because they cover up the drinking, they make excuses for the alcoholic, that's when this codependent dance gets very, very toxic and dangerous. So if you can in this moment, just take some time to think about your closest relationships and ask yourself, are they a two-way street? Do they strengthen and nurture both of you, or are you taking advantage of your partner or your relationship, or are they taking advantage of you? And all of us know that when you call somebody and you say, hi, how are you? And they launch into everything about themselves and they never ask you about you, at some point that gets exhausting, and I'm not sure what I'm getting out of that other than there's a voice on the other end of the phone, and because I'm so lonely, I'd rather hear somebody talking about themselves than nothing at all, which ends up making me feel more lonely and more shameful. So that's what I was talking about in terms of eliminating all the things in your life that distract you from your true loneliness. So if I only have a friend who's narcissistic, who only talks about themselves, where it's all about them, and that's all I've got, it's better to cut that person loose and just kind of hit bottom into the loneliness so that I can start to look for people that are healthier, because it's going to force me out of my comfort zone. It's going to force me to get involved in clubs, organizations, with more people at work, so that I can meet somebody who can actually meet me in a friendship. So does anybody have any questions about this, or do you want to maybe chat something about a relationship you're in that you think maybe needs to you need to give their pink slip? Okay, so it doesn't look like anybody has anything to say about that. Maybe you're all okay, so here's one. Total pink slip to him, somebody. You mentioned picking your partner from the best in you. Could you elaborate? Well, I think this is a notion of David Snarch's, that we either pick people from the best in us or the worst in us. And when it's the worst in us, it's usually the most regressed part of ourselves. So if I am, let's say, 40 years old and desperate and I've never been married, and I meet somebody and it's the first person I've met and I'm just ready to get married and I'm just desperate about being alone and I marry them, that's marrying them from the worst in me. Because if the best in me really looked at that person, I'd say, you know what, they're not really right for me, or I don't really agree with this, or let's say some fundamental thing is off and I'm compromising the fundamental, like he doesn't have a sense of humor. Let's say he's a total bore, but he's a nice guy and he earns a living and he's kind of good enough, and I'm desperate and I want to get married, and I marry him. And then, a month, 6 months, a year, 5 years into the marriage, I hate him because he's such a bore and he has no sense of humor. It's because I picked him from the worst in me. The best in me would have said, he's a nice guy, but I really need somebody who's funny in order to be in a long-term happy relationship. So I'm going to pass. I'm going to tolerate my loneliness, and I'm going to pass on that. And so that is a sort of simple, superficial example. A more complicated one is when we choose people from a regressed part of ourselves emotionally, where it's more about the desperation of just an intolerable desperation of being alone because I haven't done my own work and my own therapy, or I haven't worked a program, or I haven't reflected on myself. So I'm actually grabbing what they call in SLAA, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, a hostage. I'm just taking a hostage because I need somebody. I'm drowning here. And that is really unfair to myself and unfair to the poor soul who thinks I'm together when I'm really not because I haven't done my work. So choosing from the best of you is important with whether you're choosing a love relationship or a friend. Someone says, I find it hard to let go of even a casual relationship hookup. Well, if that's difficult for you, I would suggest you look at what your love addiction issues are. And women are funny that way, especially after a certain age. You know, for women, it's almost like once women have sex with a man, they start to fall in love with them. And I think that has to do with the oxytocin release, that we start to get attached very, very quickly. Men don't attach as quickly unless they're love addicts, but men can have sex and just enjoy it and have casual sex and move on, especially if, you know, let's assuming somebody's not a sex addict. But once women have sex, it starts to mean something to them. And that's being irresponsible on the front end if you're not talking to the person you're about to have sex with and say, you know what, I need to talk to this person about what this is going to mean for me because I'm not just going to be able to go away easily. And that person might say, you know what, I'm not the right guy for you to have sex with. Or you maybe have to look at that and see that you actually aren't very good at casually hooking up, that you need to date somebody and you need to let them know that sex has meaning to you, and you need to find somebody who's okay with that. There are plenty of men out there who only want to have sex that has meaning also, that they're not into casual hookups. So choose more wisely, I would say. Here's a question about, or statement, making the choice about what is, if they only talk about themselves, is a most tricky situation. My expectation is that the choice is most murky and I don't have a good flashlight for those waters. Well, I think you have to just pay attention to the content of the conversation. So I'm going to give you an example, and this is with all love and respect for my mother, who I've talked about before, who's 86. And she's never going to be online, so she's not going to hear this. Because she's 86, she has some moderate cognitive decline, so she doesn't remember what she told me the other day. And I'll call her and I'll say, hi, Mom, how are you? And she'll start telling me what she's doing. And she will tell me everything she told me the day before, and then she'll tell me something else, some other annoyance for her. And she may never say to me, how are you? How was your day? How was this? How are that? She doesn't act as a mother in the way that she used to, nor maybe should she at this point. I can't go to her for that because she doesn't have that to give me at this time. And certainly there's some sadness and grief about that because it's the sadness of her aging and eventually saying goodbye. So I'm aware that if I'm having a bad day or a hard day, I can't go to her. I have to go to a girlfriend who's there for me, or my husband who can give me some constructive feedback, because she'll just start telling me about her roses and her plants and her whatever. So I am not going to get rid of my relationship with my mother, but if that was a friend relationship or somebody I was dating, after a while I would start to feel very, very lonely. And that's what we're talking about. Choosing people who can mirror back to us, who can have empathy, who can love us, who can care for us, is what starts to make the loneliness go away. But if we continue to choose people that are self-centered or narcissistic, and they only always leave us feeling on the outside and lonely again, then we're a party to doing this to ourselves. Someone says, I live in abandonment and constant fear as a child. Now looking back at most of my romantic relationships, I get involved with addicts of some type, work, gambling, sex, alcohol, drugs, and I'm codependent. That is why I'm here to break the cycle. Well, I would say congratulations and good for you. That takes a tremendous amount of courage. And that means you're going to have to work a really strong program in one of the relational programs, probably Al-Anon if you haven't already, and go to therapy and start to read as much as you can about creating internal boundaries for yourself. I also want to tell you that right now the Meadows, which is a treatment center in Wickenburg, Arizona, if you call 1-800-MEADOWS, have a week-long program called Survivors Week, and it's a really great program that works on developmental immaturity, which is a nice word for codependence, and moving from being developmentally immature to being a functional adult. And right now, the Meadows, if you call before May 31st, they have a 20% discount on that program, which is somewhere around $2,000. So it's pretty affordable given what treatment centers charge today. And you stay in a local motel and you get yourself there, but it's a lot of bang for your buck. And so if you really want to put some, let's say, fuel on your fire, given that you're already doing therapy and going to program and et cetera, doing a week-long program like that would be great. And the number is 1-800-MEADOWS, at the risk of sounding like an infomercial, but it's a great program, and I think people can get a lot out of it. So by both using people and isolating from them, both of those things pale in effectiveness compared to seeking genuine human relatedness. And again, if you are in a marriage, if you're in a relationship where you feel lonely and alone, you have to stop badgering your partner about that and start to really look at yourself, who you are, who that person is. If the two of you can get help together, then you absolutely should. If that person is unwilling or they're in an active addiction, then you have to really have the courage to take care of yourself. And part of recovery is making what Patrick Carnes calls a covenant with the self and coming to your own rescue. If you don't come to your own rescue as an adult, nobody will. And even though that baby is screaming inside for somebody to come, they're not going to come when we're adults. And actually that's why Harville Hendricks says we get so angry in relationships, is because, the more we don't get our needs met with our partner, the louder we get, the more badgering we can get and complaining we can get, because the internal baby is screaming to get what it wants and needs. So advocate for yourself. Be your own best advocate. Take care of what you need and then address that with your partner. I also want to remind you that, here at CST-S, that we also treat sex and love addiction and do a lot of couples work where we help people learn how to have mirroring conversations that really build validation and empathy into the system, as well as helping people starting, to renew the romance in their relationship as well. So you can call us anytime. We have intake counselors standing by. Okay, so let's see what other points we have here. So start now. That's what I'm talking about. I'm giving you some ideas to go ahead and take action now. Set the intention to change your pattern. Then take one small step to connect sincerely with one other person or within your community. That's all it takes to begin your ascent out of loneliness. That's the beauty of 12-step programs. It's when two people are gathered, when you can pick up the phone and call somebody. Maybe you met somebody as an acquaintance. Maybe you need to join the Sierra Club and go for a hike so that you meet people in common so you can go out to, organized meals with them. But what one thing can you do today to pull yourself out of loneliness? And that means contact with another human being. It doesn't mean getting online. It doesn't mean reading something. It means where is another human being that can look you in the eye, that can say, I hear you, you matter, I like you, let's do this again, that will help you on this journey. Because when two people gather together with honesty, I believe that magic can happen. So don't lose faith. It's a lot of hard work, but you must advocate for yourself, and you must reach out to people that can give you the help you need. So as I said, Calling Center for Healthy Sex, we've got lots of resources. We can send you information for treatment around the country, recommend books. Anything we can do on our end to help you, we will. But more importantly, find people in your community that can help you. So thank you all again, as usual, for the conversation. I really love getting your chats and hearing from all of you, and believe that you're an unbelievably brave group of people. Those of you that are taking your issues on and moving towards your higher potential, it's really very heartening to hear. So take good care, and I will see you next month. And as usual, you will get an email from us about when our next meeting is. All right, take care and be well.